Today what I'd like to do is to take you through the sheep brain dissection, and I'm going to follow the outline that I gave you. We're going to start on the front page, brain external anatomy, and I'm going to take you down through the outline and try to point out each of these various structures. Now we're looking at the ventral side of the brain right now. If I turn this over, we're looking at the dorsal side. What you can see is that the large part of the brain, this part, what we call the forebrain, consists largely of two cerebral hemispheres, a right and a left hemisphere, separated from one another by a deep split that's held together here by some of the meninges, the pia mater. And if I open this up, if I turn it just right, perhaps you can see right down here in the bottom there's a white structure called the corpus callosum, and these are commissural fibers that connect the two hemispheres. While we're here, let's take a look at the surface. You can see that the surface is wrinkled, or we say convoluted. It consists of little hills like you see here, separated by little valleys like you see here. Each of the little hills is called a gyrus. Each of the little valleys is called a sulcus. A deep sulcus like this is usually called a fissure. So this is called the longitudinal fissure. We usually divide the cerebral hemispheres into lobes, and the lobes are named for the bones that sit above them. So up here are the frontal lobes. In this area are the parietal lobes. Back here are the occipital lobes. And if we turn the brain over, you can see the temporal lobes here. Okay, while we're here, on this side, on the ventral side, you can see these structures here. These structures are called the olfactory bulbs. They sit on the cribriform plate of the ethmoid, and the olfactory or smell nerves come from the nasal passages through the cribriform plate and terminate here in the olfactory bulbs. And then those signals travel along a little white streak that you can maybe see right here or here. These are called the olfactory tracts, and they go back to the sensory part of the brain that perceives smell, which we'll look at later. What else can we see? We can see the optic nerves here and here. These are sensory to the eye. These are cranial nerves number 2. The medial visual fields decussate or cross over, and they do that right here in what is called the optic chiasma. A chiasma is a word that means cross. And then they enter the brain here as the optic tracts. Right here is a structure that we're going to remove in a minute, but I want you to look at it right now. This is called the pituitary gland, or in Greek we call it the hypophysis. And there are some important structures we're going to see underneath it, so we're going to remove it in just a second. The pituitary gland is attached to the brain right here by a slender stalk. You can see it right here. It's called the infundibulum. The infundibulum. What I'm going to do is remove this central portion, but I want to preserve these important cranial nerves right here. These are called the trigeminal nerves, and we want to save those. So I'm going to go right underneath here and cut there. I'm going to go right underneath here, cut there. I'm going to cut the infundibulum, and then we should be able to lift up the pituitary gland, and I'm going to just set this over here out of the way. Now what you can see beneath that, again, here's the infundibulum. If I move that out of the way, you can see these two little white bumps sitting right next to one another. These are called the mammillary bodies. They're part of the hypothalamus. They're located in the forebrain. Just past the mammillary bodies, right here, begins the midbrain, and the midbrain goes all the way back to here, to this rounded structure called the pons. That's part of the hindbrain. So right here is midbrain, and what we can see on this side of the midbrain are called the cerebral peduncles, and these are projection tracts. These are sensory tracts going up to the brain and motor tracts that are coming down from the brain, and where they travel through the midbrain. Here we call these cerebral peduncles. Also, you can see these two little flat cranial nerves right here. These are called the oculomotor nerves, and they are motor to the eye. Again, these nerves, well, before we do anything else there, let me turn this over and I'm going to show you the backside of the midbrain. If I flex the brainstem right here, again there's a little pia mater there that I need to get rid of, you can see the backside or the dorsal side of the midbrain, and it consists of four rounded structures, two larger ones here and two smaller ones here. The larger ones are called superior colliculi, and the two smaller ones here are called inferior colliculi. By the way, that slit shouldn't be there. Also, one other structure while we're back here that I want to show you. If I clean away this pia mater right here, you can see a bump right back here. This is called the pineal gland, and it is part of the forebrain. Okay, and by the way, this deep split across here is called the transverse fissure. Transverse fissure. Okay. What I'd like to do is to show you some of the other nerves. If you look over here on the side, right here is a small cranial nerve. This is called the trochlear nerve. This is motor to the eye. There's a small nerve right here. Its mate is right here. This is called the abducens nerve. This is also a motor to the eye. If you look over here on the side, you can see this long nerve that runs right along here. This is called the accessory nerve. Right in this area here, you can see some small nerve rootlets. There's actually more of them than you can see here. Some of them have been torn off, but they run all along here. This is the hypoglossal nerve. Hypoglossal nerve. The ones on this side have been removed. Okay. So what I like to do, and by the way, while we're back here, the hindbrain consists of three major parts. This rounded part called the pons, or the pons varoli. This part, which is called the medulla oblongata, and on the dorsal side, this large part called the cerebellum. Cerebellum. And then from here back, this is spinal cord. Okay. Now, if you turn your sheet over, we're going to make two different kinds of sections here. Half of us are going to do a section where we divide the brain into exactly equal halves, right and left halves, and this is called a mid-sagittal section. The other half of us are going to make a frontal section. We're going to do it right here. Remember, this is called the infundibulum. We're going to do what's called an infundibular section, and we're going to cut the brain frontally right here at the level of the infundibulum. Okay. Here's a brain that's been cut mid-sagittally, and right here is that longitudinal fissure, that deep split that separates the two hemispheres. And at the bottom, we could see a white structure right here. It's called the corpus callosum, and you can see what it looks like in this side view. This area right here is called the fornix. On either side, there is a large space filled with cerebrospinal fluid called the lateral ventricles. And the two lateral ventricles are separated from one another by a thin membrane that you can see right here. I've just torn it, I've just cut it. It's right here. It's called the septum pellucidum. Let me show you another brain where the septum has been removed. Again, what you can see at the top is the corpus callosum. Remember, these are commissural fibers. They're connecting the two halves of the hemisphere. Down here is what's called the fornix. This large space that you can see here is the lateral ventricle in the right hemisphere. Each of the ventricles has a little vascular organ. You can see this one right here. This is called the choroid plexus of the right lateral ventricle, and each of the ventricles has one of these things. Below the fornix is this area right here on the midline. This is called the third ventricle. Third ventricle has some commissural fibers that traverse it, that go across it right here. This is called the intermediate mass, and it connects the two halves of the thalamus that sit on either side. Right here's the pineal gland that we were looking at before in a different view. Right here's the optic chiasma. Right here is the mammillary bodies. The midbrain goes from right here to right here. Okay, so this is the midbrain. And on the ventral side, remember we said this was called the cerebral peduncles. These are sensory tracts that are coming up and motor tracts that are coming down, and they travel through the ventral side of the midbrain, and we call them the cerebral peduncles. Centrally is a tubular structure right here that carries cerebral spinal fluid from the upper three ventricles to the fourth ventricle, which is located down here in the hindbrain. This is called the cerebral aqueduct, or the aqueduct of Sylvius, or the mesencephalic aqueduct. And then on the dorsal side, remember we saw this large and this smaller rounded structure that we called the superior and inferior colliculi. Those four, the two superior and the two inferior colliculi, are together called the corpora quadrigemina. Corpora quadrigemina. Here's the cerebellum. Oh, by the way, this is the pons right here. This is hindbrain. Here's the medulla oblongata here, and here's the cerebellum, the three parts of the hindbrain. When you look at this mid-sagittally cut cerebellum, you can see an arrangement of gray and white matter that looks kind of like a tree in winter, a branching tree, and it's sometimes called the tree of life, or the arbor vitae in Latin. The arbor vitae. Okay, the other section we were going to do, remember, was to do a frontal section right here at the level of the infundibulum, and I have one of those right here. Some things to see. Right here's the longitudinal fissure, comes right down to here. At the bottom is this white structure called the corpus callosum, and below that are the two lateral ventricles, which you can see here and here, separated right here on the midline by the septum pellucidum. The bottom of the lateral ventricles is what we call the fornix, and you can see that here is kind of a flap. Below that's the third ventricle. Part of the third ventricle is there, and part of the third ventricle is located right here. On either side of the third ventricle, in this general area here, is the thalamus. And remember, the two halves of the thalamus connect across the third ventricle right here as the intermediate mass. One of the things they're going to ask you to identify probably is going to be the caudate nucleus. The caudate nucleus is some gray matter that's located right here at the lateral edges of the lateral ventricles. Notice also you can see the little gyri and the sulci that make up the surface of the brain, and on the surface is what we call gray matter. Remember, gray matter we said was cell bodies of neurons and unmyelinated fibers, and they connect to white matter, to myelinated fibers that travel down through the brain as various association, commissural, and projection fibers. If I can see anything better here. Maybe if I tip this like this, you can see the darker color right here. This is where the two halves of the thalamus are located, and right here on the midline is the intermediate mass, and you can see the white matter maybe a little bit better there.